The gun pressed cold and certain against Owen Ramsey's temple, and Winifred Shelton stood 10 feet away with her heart shattering into pieces so small she was certain she would never find them all again. "Tell her," the man holding the gun said. His name was Dale Prout, and he had the dead eyes of someone who had long ago decided that other people's lives were nothing more than currency. "Tell her what you were really doing in Caldwell. Tell her why you followed her here." Owen's jaw worked. His hands were raised, steady and slow, the way a man holds himself when he is deciding whether to live or die on his own terms. His eyes found Winifred across the dusty saloon floor, and in them she saw something she had not expected. Not guilt, not the cold calculation of a man caught in a betrayal, something raw and terrible and honest. "You were hired to find me," she said, and her voice did not shake. She had spent 28 years making sure her voice never shook. "By my father." Owen said nothing. "Answer me." The words came out harder than she intended, sharper, like the edge of a knife she had not known she was carrying. "Winifred, answer me, Owen." The silence stretched between them like the Kansas plains outside, wide and merciless and offering no shelter. Dale Prout smiled, which was somehow worse than the gun. "He was paid $300, Dale said pleasantly. "Your daddy put out the notice in Wichita. Find Winifred Shelton, bring her home to Hays City, collect the bounty. Ramsey here was the one who took the job." He tilted his head. "Course, then he went and complicated things." Winifred looked at Owen, and she felt the betrayal spread through her chest like ink dropped in water, dark and total and unstoppable. 6 weeks. 6 weeks she had trusted this man. 6 weeks she had let herself believe, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, that someone was riding beside her because they chose to, not because they had been bought. "You were not part of my plan," Owen said slowly. The words hit her like a physical blow. He held her gaze, and his voice changed, dropped to something quieter, something that had no business being said in front of a man with a gun. "I am glad plans change." 3 seconds passed in which the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then Owen moved. To understand how Winifred Shelton came to be standing in a saloon in Dodge City with a broken heart, and a man she both loved and hated fighting for his life, you have to go back 6 weeks to the moment she climbed out of her bedroom window in Hays City, Kansas, on a moonless October night in 1878, with nothing but $32, a carpet bag, and a letter she had stolen from her father's desk. Winifred was 26 years old, which in Hays City meant she was already considered a peculiarity. Women her age were married or widowed, and either way they were tethered to something. She was neither. Her father, Gerald Shelton, was a man of considerable local standing, which meant he was a man who had traded considerable local influence to keep his daughter's name clean, and he had done this with a thoroughness that Winifred had only just begun to understand was a cage. The letter on his desk had been addressed to a man named Corbin Webb in Wichita. It detailed an arrangement between Gerald Shelton and one Judge Harlan Cross of Topeka regarding the compulsory transfer of Winifred's small inheritance, left to her by her maternal grandmother and held in trust until her 26th birthday, which had been 3 weeks prior, to a bank account that bore Gerald Shelton's name and no one else's. The inheritance was $4,200. It was also, she understood with cold and sudden clarity, the only reason her father had kept her home as long as he had. Unmarried daughters were burdens. Unmarried daughters with inheritances that could be redirected through the right legal channels were investments. She had read the letter twice, replaced it exactly as she had found it, walked upstairs with a face so perfectly composed that the housekeeper commented on how well she was looking, and then spent 4 hours sitting on her bed planning her escape. She left that same night. Winifred had a destination. She had a cousin, Marjorie, living in Colorado Territory near a town called Pueblo, who had written to her twice in the past year inviting her to come west. Marjorie's letters were warm and frank and smelled faintly of pine, and they described a life that seemed to Winifred like something from another world entirely. Wide open spaces, Work that was difficult and real. A husband who was kind. The suggestion, gentle but persistent, that there was room in Colorado for a woman who wanted to build something of her own. She took the stage out of Hays City before dawn and was in Dodge City by the following afternoon, which was where the trouble started. Dodge City in October of 1878 was not quite the war zone it had been in earlier years, but it was still a place that chewed up the unprepared and spat them out with nothing left in their pockets. The cattle drives had slowed with the season, but the gamblers and the drifters remained, and the saloons along Front Street did brisk business regardless of what month it was. Winifred had planned to change stages in Dodge and continue southwest toward Pueblo. What she had not planned for was that the stage line's connection to Pueblo would be delayed by 4 days due to a broken axle somewhere near the Arkansas River crossing. 4 days in Dodge City with $32 and nowhere to go. She found a boarding house on the south side of Front Street, run by a woman named Elsa Vogel who charged 75 cents a night and asked no questions, which was exactly the kind of establishment Winifred needed. She paid for 2 nights up front and spent the first afternoon walking the town and calculating how far her remaining money would take her. It was not far enough. She was sitting in the dining room of Elsa Vogel's boarding house that first evening, working through a bowl of bean soup and trying to solve the mathematics of her situation, when the door opened and Owen Ramsey walked in. She noticed him the way you notice a thunderstorm building on the horizon, not because he was loud or dramatic, but because there was a quality of contained energy about him, the sense of a man who was always watching. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that made her think of sage after rain. He wore a plain dark coat and a battered hat and carried himself with the careful economy of movement of a man who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. He sat down 2 tables from her and ordered coffee and cornbread and did not look at her once, which was precisely why she noticed him. Every other man in the dining room had glanced at her at least twice. She was used to it. She was a woman traveling alone, and in 1878 that was still unusual enough to attract speculation. But this man ate his cornbread and drank his coffee and read a folded newspaper with the focused attention of someone who genuinely had no interest in anything else. She went to bed and thought nothing more about him. She thought more about him the next morning when she came downstairs to find him at the same table, this time with a cup of coffee and a worn leather notebook. He was writing in with methodical concentration. He looked up when she entered, and for one instant those gray-green eyes moved over her face with a kind of quick, cataloging attention that was so brief and so complete that she felt slightly unnerved. Then he looked back down at his notebook. "Good morning," she said, because she was not in the habit of being intimidated. "Morning," he said, without looking up. She sat down and ordered eggs. It was Elsa Vogel bringing a plate of biscuits who made the introduction. "Miss Shelton, you ought to meet Mr. Ramsey. He's also waiting on the Pueblo stage." She set the biscuits down with the satisfied air of a woman who considers introductions a civic duty. 2 people going the same direction ought to know each other. Winifred looked at Owen Ramsey. Owen Ramsey looked at Winifred Shelton. "Owen Ramsey," he said. "Winifred Shelton," she said. "You going to Pueblo? Eventually, you." Passing through. Neither of them said anything else for a full minute, and then, because the silence had become almost comical, she said, "What brings you through Pueblo?" He considered this with genuine thought, which she found unusual. Most men answered questions about themselves immediately and at length. "Work," he said finally. "I do locating work." Locating. Finding things, finding people, he paused, for those who have lost them. She understood immediately that this description was doing a great deal of work with very few words, and she filed it away with the careful precision of a woman who had learned that information about other people was more valuable than information about herself. "Honest work," she said neutrally. Something moved across his face that might have been amusement, or might have been something more complicated. Mostly, he said. Over the next 3 days, thrown together by the enforced proximity of a small boarding house and a shared waiting period, they developed something that Winifred might not yet have called friendship, but that was definitely not nothing. They ate meals in the same room. They walked the same limited circuit of safe streets because Front Street after dark was not the place for a lone woman, and Owen Ramsey seemed to have concluded, without being asked or making a fuss about it, that he would simply be nearby. She appreciated this without saying so. On the second day, while they were walking along the edge of the Arkansas River, she made the mistake of asking him where he was from originally, and he went quiet in a way that told her everything she needed to know about that particular question, which was that she should not ask it again. She did not. He seemed to appreciate this without saying so either. On the third day, the trouble that had been building like that thunderstorm on the horizon broke open. She came back to the boarding house in the afternoon to find two men sitting in Elsa Vogel's front parlor who did not belong there. They were well dressed in the specific way that men hired by money rather than earning it themselves tended to be well dressed, expensive coats worn a little too self-consciously, boots not quite broken in. One of them she did not know. The other one she recognized immediately, with a lurch of cold dread in her stomach, as Dale Prout, who worked intermittently for her father as a kind of legal enforcer, serving papers and collecting debts, and doing the unpleasant work that Gerald Shelton did not want his own name attached to. Winifred stopped in the doorway, and Dale Prout looked at her with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Miss Shelton," he said. "Your father sends his regards." She turned around and walked back out the door. She walked 3 blocks before she stopped, which was long enough for her heartbeat to come down from its initial panic sprint to something closer to a determined gallop. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside a hardware store and thought with rapid, cold clarity. They had found her faster than she expected. Her father's resources were, apparently, more extensive than she had accounted for. She had perhaps 12 hours, perhaps less, before Dale Prout convinced Elsa Vogel to let him into her room, found her carpetbag, and had enough to argue before a local lawman that she was a dependent returning to her family home. She needed to be out of Dodge City tonight. The problem was that she did not have enough money to bribe her way onto a freight wagon or pay for a horse, and she did not know this town well enough to navigate it safely after dark on her own. She was standing there working through the very limited options available to her when Owen Ramsey appeared at her left shoulder. "2 men at Elsa's," he said. She looked at him. "You saw them." "Sat in the parlor for half an hour before you got back. The one with the gray coat does this kind of work for hire." He said it with the particular flatness of a man relaying information he has sorted and assessed already. "Who sent them?" She looked at him for a long moment. She had known this man for 3 days. He was quiet and watchful and had, by every available evidence, been kind to her without wanting anything in return, and she had no reason at all to trust him with the truth. "My father," she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something. "I need to leave tonight," she said, "before they can present any legal argument for my return. Once I'm out of Kansas, the situation becomes considerably more complicated for him." "Colorado's a territory," Owen said. "Federal jurisdiction, less tidy for family disputes." He thought for a moment. "I have a horse." "I noticed you have a horse. I cannot afford to buy it." "I'm not selling it." He looked at her with those quiet, assessing eyes. "I'm offering to ride with you to Pueblo. I was going that direction anyway." This was the moment she would understand later, when everything changed. When the plan that both of them had been carrying, separate and unshared and private, began to shift into something neither of them had accounted for. She should have said no. A woman with her particular combination of pride and self-sufficiency should have declined the offer of a man she barely knew and found another way. But the truth was that the other ways were considerably worse, and Winifred Shelton, for all her pride, was also practical. "I can ride," she said. "I know," he said. He had, she realized, been paying attention. "I will pay you back when I reach my cousin. You don't owe me anything." "I will pay you back," she said again, because this was not negotiable. He almost smiled. Not quite, but the corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested the capability. "All right," he said. They left Dodge City 2 hours before midnight, riding south and west under a sky that was all stars and no moon, the Arkansas River a dark ribbon to their north, the plains spreading out around them in every direction like a held breath. She rode a borrowed horse from the livery. Owen had arranged it with the quick competence of a man who understood how to get things done without explaining himself, and they moved at a good steady pace without speaking, because the night was quiet enough that voices carried, and because Winifred was holding herself very carefully against the specific terror of doing something irrevocable. She had left her life, not just her father's house, her life. The version of herself that Hays City knew, that was legible and contained and comprehensible. She was riding through the dark Kansas plains toward a cousin she had not seen in 4 years, and the only person between her and complete aloneness was a man named Owen Ramsey, who had told her he located missing things for money, and who had looked at her with those eyes that saw too much, and offered her his help without asking for anything in return. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to think about those eyes. By dawn they had crossed into Indian Territory's eastern border range, and the landscape was changing around them in ways that Winifred found beautiful in spite of everything, the short grass giving way to low hills and scattered stands of cottonwood turning gold with October. They stopped to water the horses at a creek and ate the bread and dried meat that Owen had packed with the same unassuming practicality with which he seemed to do everything. "Tell me something," she said. They were sitting on opposite banks of the creek, which was narrow enough that the request was easy, and she was tired enough that her careful social filters were running slow. The locating work. You always find what you're looking for. He thought about this with that characteristic deliberateness. Almost always, he said, there's a different question, which is, what to do with it once you've found it. She looked at him across the narrow water. And what do you generally do? He picked up a flat stone and looked at it. Depends on what the finding turns out to mean, he said, and then he threw the stone into the water and stood up, and she did not press any further. They rode for 5 days. The days established a rhythm that felt, despite the circumstances, almost natural. Owen rode slightly ahead on narrow trails and level with her on open ground, and he did not treat her like something fragile, which she found she appreciated more than any other single quality he possessed. He answered her questions directly, and asked his own with a careful restraint that suggested he understood the difference between interest and intrusion. He could be silent for hours without it feeling hostile, which was a quality she had not previously known she valued in a person. On the second night, camped beside a low stream with a fire small enough to cast more shadow than light, she told him about the letter she had found. Not everything. Not the exact amounts or the name of the judge, but enough. Enough for him to understand what her father had been doing and why she had run. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You did right." 2 words. But the certainty in them was absolute, and something in her chest that had been knotted since she climbed out of that window in Hays City loosened just slightly, just enough to breathe around. "You're very certain of that," she said, "for someone who doesn't know all the particulars." "I know enough," he said. "A man who steals from his own daughter has made his character clear." She looked at the fire. "He would say he was protecting my interests." "They always say that." The flatness with which he said it told her, clearly and without elaboration, that he had personal knowledge of this particular category of person. She did not press. On the 3rd day, they ran into trouble. It came in the form of 3 men on a ridge above the trail they were following, which was a narrow cut through low sandstone hills about 50 miles into the Oklahoma Panhandle. Owen saw them first, his head coming up with that animal alertness that she had noticed before, and he put a hand out and she stopped her horse without being told why. "3 riders on the ridge," he said quietly. "They've been following our dust since mid-morning. Dale Prout. Can't tell from here, but they're not traveling, they're waiting." His eyes moved over the terrain with rapid assessment. "There's a dry wash to the east. If we move now before they adjust their position, we can use it to cut south and come up behind the ridge line on the far side." She looked at the ridge. She looked at the wash. She looked at Owen Ramsey's profile, the clean angle of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands on the reins. "Lead the way," she said. The next 40 minutes were some of the most focused of her life, following Owen through the dry wash at a pace that was just below reckless, trusting him with her direction in a way that felt both practical and, if she was honest with herself, something slightly more than practical. They came up out of the wash on the far side of the ridge, and the three men on the ridge were looking the wrong way entirely. They were miles past them before either Owen or Winifred spoke. "Who taught you to read terrain like that?" she asked. "Army," he said briefly. "You were a soldier." "Once." She waited. "7th Cavalry," he said finally. "Until 1874. She processed this. 1874 was the year of the Red River War, and before that the 7th Cavalry had ridden through Indian Territory on expeditions she knew enough history to understand were not uncomplicated, and she thought she understood now a little better why Owen Ramsey looked at certain kinds of orders with a specific flatness in his eyes. "And then," she said. "And then I wasn't," he said. She let it rest. That night, sitting by their fire, the silence between them was different. It had weight to it, but it was not an uncomfortable weight. It was the weight of two people who were beginning to trust each other with things that were not easy to trust people with, and who were both aware of this fact, and who were proceeding carefully because of it. "You have someone in Pueblo?" he asked. "Beyond your cousin?" "No," she said. "Marjorie and her husband, that's all." "What will you do there?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it extensively in the long riding hours, in the quiet nights. Marjorie's husband runs a small trading operation. He mentioned in a letter that he could use someone who was good with accounts and correspondence. She paused. "I am good with accounts and correspondence." "I expect you're good at most things you put your mind to," Owen said, and the way he said it was so completely without flattery that it landed as something better than a compliment. It landed as an observation. She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Don't do that," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "Do what?" "Say things that are difficult to answer," she said, and he almost smiled again, that almost smile that she was beginning to think she would spend considerable energy trying to earn. They entered Colorado territory on the 5th day, crossing a landscape that was wider and more dramatic than anything she had encountered before, the flat plains giving way to rolling swells of ground with the faint blue suggestion of mountains in the far western distance. The sky was enormous. The air had a quality to it that was different from Kansas, drier and thinner, and somehow more honest. Winifred felt something in her chest begin to open up that she did not quite have a name for. "It's different here," she said. "Colorado does that," Owen said. She looked at him. "You've been here before. Several times. For work." "Yes." She thought about the work he did, finding people. Finding things. The particular quality of attention he turned on the world around him, the way nothing seemed to escape his notice. It was, she realized, both a professional habit and something older than the profession. Something formed early, in circumstances she did not know yet but could feel the shape of. On the 5th evening, 20 miles south of Pueblo, they camped for the last time, and the knowledge that this was the last night sat between them with a significance neither of them addressed directly. They ate. They were quiet. The stars came out over Colorado like something spilled and brilliant. "After Pueblo," she said finally, because someone had to say something. "Where are you going?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hadn't fully decided," he said, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth. She should have noticed that. She would later understand that she had noticed it and had chosen not to look at it directly because there was a part of her that did not want to see what was behind the evasion. "Well," she said, "if your path brings you back through Colorado territory, I expect I'll be here." He looked at her across the fire. The flames moved between them, throwing light and shadow in alternating measure, and his face in that light was serious and still and contained something she recognized because she had seen its reflection in her own mirror often enough. The look of a person holding something back. "Winifred," he said. "Owen," she said. They looked at each other for a long, suspended moment, and then the moment passed, and they went to their respective bedrolls, and she lay on her back and looked at the stars and told herself very firmly that she was being practical and intelligent, and was not going to develop feelings for a man she had known for 5 days who had specifically said he was only passing through. She was not, she told herself, going to think about those gray-green eyes. She thought about them for 2 hours before she slept. They reached Pueblo the following afternoon, and Marjorie's welcome was everything the letters had suggested it would be: warm and loud, and uncomplicated in the best possible way. Marjorie Webb was 30 years old and had her grandmother's red hair and her mother's practical common sense, and the ease of a woman who had built something real in a wide-open place and felt good about it. Her husband Thomas was a solid, quiet man who gripped Owen's hand with genuine warmth when Winifred introduced him and said, "Any man who got my cousin safely across 3 territories is a man I'm glad to meet." Owen stayed for supper. He stayed for the night, taking a room at Pueblo's single hotel on Thomas's insistence. He was going to leave in the morning. She knew it. She had known it since the last campfire, and she had been preparing herself for it with the methodical care that she applied to all difficult things, laying the facts out clearly. He had worked elsewhere. He was not a settling kind of man. She had barely known him a week. And then in the morning she came down to Marjorie's kitchen and found him sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the look on his face of a man who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She sat down across from him and waited. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Before I came to Dodge City," he said, "I took a job." The cold came into her chest so slowly that for a moment she did not recognize it. "Your father put a notice out of Wichita 3 weeks ago," Owen said. "Find Winifred Shelton. Bring her home, $300. The cold reached her heart. "I took the job," he said. He said it without flinching, which she respected even as she wanted to throw something at him. "I was in Wichita when the notice went out. I tracked you to the Dodge City stage office." He stopped, started again. "I arrived at Elsa Vogel's boarding house the evening before you did." She stared at him. "I watched you at supper," he said. "I watched you the next morning. I read the situation, the 2 men from your father, the stage delay, the position you were in." His voice was very quiet and very steady, "and I made a different decision." "You decided not to collect your bounty," she said. Her voice was neutral in the way that things are neutral when they are containing enormous force. "I decided you were not going back to Hayes City against your will," he said. "Not while I was the one who'd been paid to make that happen. Because you had a crisis of conscience. Because it was wrong. The simplicity of it was absolute. What your father is doing is wrong, and I had taken money to help him do it, and that made me part of it, and I am not." He stopped. "I don't do wrong things, not anymore. Not anymore." The weight of that was considerable. She was silent for a long time. Outside Marjorie's window, Pueblo was waking up, the sound of horses and wagon wheels and the distant call of someone's rooster. "The money," she said. "I didn't take payment up front. The 300 was on delivery." He paused. "I am not owed anything. And Dale Prout, the men on the ridge. Prout must have gotten to Dodge before I left. He saw me with you and drew his own conclusions about which way I was playing it." Owen's jaw tightened. "He's not a man who lets go of something easily." "No," she said. "He isn't." She sat with the full shape of it. The betrayal, or what had nearly been a betrayal, and its transformation into something she did not yet have the right word for. He had taken the job. He had found her. And then, sitting in a boarding house dining room, watching a woman eating bean soup with the focused composure of someone trying very hard to hold herself together, he had decided that the plan was wrong and he would not follow it. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. He looked at her. "Because I was going to leave this morning without telling you, and I couldn't." "Why not?" The silence before his answer was the longest yet. "Because you deserve the truth," he said, "even when it makes me look worse." She stood up and walked to the window. She stood there for a long time, watching the street outside, thinking about truth and plans and the way some decisions announce themselves only after they've already been made. "You are an infuriating man," she said at last. "I know," he said. "You should have told me before we left Dodge." "Yes," he said. "I might have managed this better if I'd had more time to be angry." "Probably," he said. She turned around and looked at him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away easily, and she felt the anger and the betrayal and the very specific, very painful awareness that she cared about this man in a way that was going to be inconvenient no matter what happened next. "Don't go this morning," she said. The words surprised her. She had not planned to say them. He didn't move. "Marjorie needs help with the trading operation," she said, because she needed something practical to hang the request on. Thomas mentioned needing another capable hand for the winter supply runs. "It's 2 months' work, maybe 3. Owen looked at the coffee cup. "You're offering me work." "I'm suggesting that you not ride away this morning," she said. "The specifics can be negotiated." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He stayed. It took her 2 weeks to fully forgive him for the initial deception, and she did this privately, in the manner of all her most significant internal work, without announcing it. She was precise in her dealings with him during those 2 weeks, professional and courteous and careful. And he accepted this, with the patience of a man who understood that he had earned it and was prepared to wait. He worked with Thomas on the supply runs, which took him out of Pueblo for days at a stretch, going north to Denver and south toward Taos and east along the Arkansas River route, collecting goods and making deliveries to the scattered settlements and ranch operations in the region. He was good at it, as she had expected. He was good at everything that required observation and navigation and the quiet management of difficult situations. And then he would come back and they would eat supper at Marjorie's table, and slowly, in the way that real things grow, the conversations between them deepened and changed. She learned things about him. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, the way you assemble a view from a hillside by walking closer. He had grown up in Missouri, the third son of a farmer who was not unkind but had very limited means of expression beyond work and disappointment. He had joined the army at 18 because the alternatives were the farm or the railroad, and neither seemed like they led anywhere he wanted to go. He had served 7 years, most of them on the frontier, and he had seen things during the campaigns in Indian Territory that had changed his understanding of what words like duty and right and wrong actually meant when they were stripped of the official language that was used to dress them up. He said this carefully, choosing words with the precision of a man who had been thinking about it for a long time. He did not dramatize it. He did not make himself the hero of the accounting. He had been a soldier doing what soldiers were ordered to do, and he had reached a point where the orders and his conscience could not be reconciled, and he had left. "And then," she said, "then I was someone who was good at finding people and knowing terrain and getting from one place to another without being noticed," he said. "There's work in that. Finding missing things," she said. "Usually people want their things found. Sometimes the things are better lost." He looked at her. "It takes judgment, and you exercise that judgment with me." "I tried to." She looked at the fire in Marjorie's parlor, which they were sitting beside after supper while Marjorie and Thomas had gone to bed. The house was quiet around them. The November wind moved against the windows. "Your dark past," she said, not unkindly. "Is that all of it?" He considered. "Mostly," he said. "There's a town in Texas I'd rather not visit again, and a card game in Abilene in 1876 that I don't discuss." She almost laughed. Not quite, but the corners of her mouth moved, and he saw it, and his almost smile came back, and they sat in Marjorie's parlor with the fire between them and the Colorado wind outside and the particular intimacy of two people who have stopped pretending they are not paying close attention to each other. "Winifred," he said. "I know," she said. "You know what I was going to say." "I have a reasonable idea," she said. He looked at her with those eyes. "And?" She looked back at him with the full weight of who she was, which was a woman who had climbed out of a window and ridden across 3 territories and confronted the truth about the man beside her and chosen to say don't go this morning, and who was not, she understood now, afraid of what she wanted. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should probably say it anyway." He set down the cup he was holding. He looked at her. And then Owen Ramsey, a man of very few unnecessary words, said, "I have spent my entire adult life moving from one place to the next and treating my lack of roots as a feature rather than a problem, and I met you in a boarding house in Dodge City and everything I thought I knew about myself started behaving differently." She breathed. "I am not a man who offers things I can't deliver," he said, "but I would like to try." He paused. "If you're willing to let someone try." She thought about her father's house. She thought about the letter on the desk and the window and the moonless night. She thought about the creek where they had sat on opposite banks, and he had said what to do with it once you've found it depends on what the finding turns out to mean. "I am willing," she said, "to let the right person try." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was warm and slightly calloused and certain, and when he wrapped it around hers the cold knot that had lived in her chest since she was probably about 19 years old loosened so completely and so suddenly that she had to breathe carefully for a moment to manage the sensation. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. Outside, the Colorado wind moved against the windows, and the fire burned between them, and they sat like that for a long time without needing to say anything else. November in Pueblo became December, and December brought snow, and in the snow Owen did not leave. He took a room in town and worked for Thomas and ate at Marjorie's table 3 nights a week, and spent the other evenings calling on Winifred with the deliberate, formal courtship of a man who understood that she valued being treated with seriousness. He brought her books he had found in Denver, which he knew she wanted because she had mentioned them once and he had been listening. He argued with her about territorial politics and livestock economics, and the question of whether women ought to have the right to vote in federal elections, and he argued with her honestly, meaning, he sometimes changed his position when she demonstrated his error, and he expected her to do the same, which she did when warranted and not otherwise. He kissed her for the first time in late December, on the porch of Marjorie's house, after a supper that had gone long and warm and good, and he asked first, which was not a thing that had previously been modeled for her as a behavior men engaged in, and the asking combined with the kissing combined with the cold, clear December air and the stars over Colorado was one of the finest moments of her 26 years. She told Marjorie the next morning. Marjorie, who had been watching the entire progression with barely contained satisfaction, said, finally, with such feeling that Thomas looked up from his breakfast and said, "What?" And Marjorie said, "Nothing. Finish your eggs." But not everything in the new life was simple. In January, a letter arrived from Hays City. It was from her father. She opened it at the kitchen table with Owen sitting across from her, because she had learned that having him there when she opened difficult things made the difficult things more manageable, which was itself a significant thing to have learned. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first was a formal demand that she return to Hays City and present herself before Judge Harlan Cross to answer questions regarding certain financial matters related to her grandmother's estate. The second was a warning that failure to do so would result in legal proceedings. The third was an appeal to her sense of family duty, written in language so hollow and rehearsed that it made her feel slightly ill. The fourth was a postscript in smaller, tighter writing that said, "I know where you are. I know who you're with. Come home, Winifred. Do not make this worse than it needs to be." She set the letter down. "He knows," Owen said. "Dale Prout knows," she said, which is the same thing. Owen read the letter without being asked. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, and then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "The financial matter he mentions," he said. "My inheritance." He's been redirecting it through a legal arrangement with Judge Cross for the past year. The letter I found on his desk was the most recent instruction. She looked at the table. If I go back, I lose any standing to contest it. The jurisdiction is local. The judge is his ally. If you don't go back, he comes after you with legal force. He'll try, she said. Colorado is a territory. Federal law applies. His local judge has no reach here. She paused. But he'll find another angle. He always does. Owen looked at her. There's a man in Denver named Cornelius Park. He practices territorial law. I've encountered him twice in work situations, and he is genuinely good. He said this carefully. It would cost money you might not have. I have $30, she said dryly. I started with 32. I have somewhat more than that, Owen said with equal dryness. She looked at him. Winifred, he said quietly, let me help. That is a great deal of money for someone who hasn't even, she stopped. Who hasn't even what? She looked at the table. Formalized any kind of arrangement, she said, which was the most circuitous way she had ever referred to marriage in her life, and she was aware of it being circuitous, and she thought he probably was too. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness that was one of his fundamental qualities, I intend to formalize an arrangement. I haven't asked yet because I thought you needed more time and because I didn't want you to think the offer was contingent on your situation. She stared at him. But if we're discussing the logistics, he said, then it seems relevant to mention. She breathed. She thought about the woman who had climbed out of a window in October and ridden through dark plains, and sat on opposite creek banks and lay awake looking at the stars, telling herself very firmly not to think about gray-green eyes. Owen Ramsey, she said. Winifred Shelton, he said. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm telling you I intend to ask you to marry me, he said. Once we've dealt with your father, because I won't propose with that hanging over us. I want you to say yes or no with nothing external putting pressure on the answer. She pressed her lips together. She pressed them together for a long moment because she was trying not to do something she had never done in front of another person, which was cry with relief. You are, she said carefully, a remarkably principled man. I try to be, he said. I will note, she said, that I know what my answer will be when the time comes. He looked at her across the table, and the almost smile that she had been cataloging since Dodge City arrived in full for one of the first times she could remember, and it turned out, extraordinary. Good, he said. They went to Denver in February. The train from Pueblo to Denver had been running since 1872, and Winifred found the journey both practical and slightly magical. The high plains passing outside the window, with a sweep and scale that still moved her even after months in Colorado. Owen sat beside her, and they read the same newspaper in companionable rotation, and his shoulder was warm and solid against hers, with the easy certainty of something that had always been there. Cornelius Park was a small, precise man of about 50, with an office full of books and the bearing of someone who has won arguments for long enough that winning had become unremarkable. He listened to the full account of Gerald Shelton's financial arrangement without interrupting, read the copy of the letter Winifred had made from memory, and said, with the measured confidence of a man who had done this before, "This is not complicated, Miss Shelton. It is simply a matter of applying the correct legal pressure in the correct jurisdiction. The inheritance was in trust under your grandmother's will," he explained. The trust terms were specific. Gerald Shelton's authority to redirect the funds through a local probate agreement depended on Winifred's status as a legal dependent, which she had ceased to be at 25. The arrangement with Judge Cross was, at minimum, irregularly obtained, and at maximum, potentially fraudulent. A letter from Park's office to the relevant federal land office and territorial attorney in Topeka, combined with a formal contestation of the probate filing, would effectively freeze the current arrangement and force the matter into federal review. And my father, she said, will have the option of contesting the federal review at considerable expense or withdrawing the probate claim, Park said. Given the irregularity of the original filing, I would anticipate the latter. He won't let it go easily, she said. Men rarely do. When they lose access to money they considered already theirs, Park said calmly. But the legal position is sound. The practical position is that you are in Colorado territory and he is in Kansas, and there is nothing he can do to compel your presence here. She walked out of Cornelius Park's office into the Denver winter air, feeling something she identified, after a moment, as freedom. Not the running kind, not the desperate escape kind, but the solid, settled, permanent kind. The kind that is built on ground that belongs to you. Owen was beside her on the boardwalk. He had been quiet through the entire meeting, which was his way when something was not his to lead, and she had appreciated it as she appreciated all his instincts about when to step forward and when to step back. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She turned and looked at him. The sun was weak and winter pale, and the mountains were white and enormous to the west, and the street around them was full of Denver in February, horses and commerce, and the particular noise of a place that was growing faster than it knew what to do with. "I believe," she said, "that the situation with my father is now being managed by the appropriate authorities." "I believe so," he said. "Which means," she said, "that there is nothing external placing pressure on any potential answers." Owen looked at her. She raised an eyebrow. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that she had not known he was carrying, that she could see was simple and good, a thin gold band with a small deep blue stone, probably turquoise, set in plain silver. He had bought it somewhere, she understood, and he had been carrying it waiting for this moment, which meant he had known this moment was coming even before she had fully admitted to herself that it was. He held it in his palm between them. "Winifred Shelton," he said. "Owen Ramsey," she said. "You were not part of my plan," he said slowly. She felt tears threaten, which she absolutely was not going to allow on a public Denver street. "You were a job I took for money, and you were a woman eating soup in a boarding house dining room, and you were completely unremarkable to me for approximately 12 hours before you became impossible to ignore." He looked at the ring, then at her. "I am glad plans change." The tears were happening anyway, quietly. She was managing them. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of what you're running from, not because of what you need, but because this is what we're choosing on purpose, eyes open, knowing what we know." "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it on her hand for a moment, this small, practical, beautiful thing, and then she looked at him. And there on the Denver boardwalk in February, with the winter sun in his face and the mountains behind him, and everything she had built over the past 4 months spread around them like the wide Colorado sky. She took his face in both hands and kissed him in a manner that was probably not entirely respectable for a public street. And he kissed her back in a way that made it clear he had no objection to this. A man walking by with a load of timber said, "Morning, folks," without missing a step, and she laughed against Owen's mouth, which was a thing she had not known she could do, laugh and be kissed at the same time, and it turned out it was one of the better things. They were married in March. The wedding was at Marjorie's house, small and warm and exactly right. A minister came from Pueblo's Methodist Church, which satisfied the formal requirements without anyone being required to pretend to convictions they did not hold. Marjorie wore her good blue dress and cried, which she did with the same cheerful directness she brought to everything. Thomas shook Owen's hand at the door and said quietly, "Take care of her." And Owen said, "She takes care of herself. I'm just honored to be nearby," which was so exactly the right answer that Thomas immediately liked him unreservedly, if he hadn't already. Winifred wore a dress of deep cream wool that Marjorie had helped her make over the past weeks, simple and well cut, and more beautiful than anything she had owned in her father's house. She carried a small bunch of dried wild grasses, because the Colorado mountains in March did not have flowers, and she thought the grasses were honest and right. Owen wore his good dark coat, and he had gotten a haircut, which she noticed and appreciated, and when she walked toward him and he saw her, the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him. Not almost a smile, a real one. open and certain and wholly undefended. "Hello," he said, which was perhaps not the most eloquent thing a man had ever said to a woman walking toward him at their own wedding, but it was Owen, and therefore it was perfect. "Hello," she said. They said their vows. The words were the traditional words, the ones that had been said in various forms across centuries and continents, and they were brief and heavy with meaning in the way of things that have lasted because they are true. Owen said them with his eyes on hers, steady and certain. She said them with her voice clear and her heart, for the first time in many years, entirely unguarded. When the minister said done, Owen kissed her with one hand, cupping her face with the same care he used for everything he valued, and Marjorie made a noise that was half sob and half celebration, and Thomas said, all right, there's food." And the small party moved to the kitchen, where there was roast chicken and cornbread, and a cake Marjorie had made with dried fruit, and a bottle of very respectable whiskey that Thomas had been saving. The letter from Cornelius Park arrived at the end of March. Gerald Shelton had withdrawn the probate claim. The Federal Review, combined with Park's correspondence to the Topeka Territorial Attorney and the specific language of the original trust instrument, had created a legal position that Park described in measured legal language, but which translated to Gerald Shelton's arrangement with Judge Cross was sufficiently irregular that pursuing it would cost more in legal exposure than the $4,200 was worth. The inheritance was released to Winifred. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Owen sat across from her. He did not say "I told you so," because he was not that kind of man. He did not fill the silence with reassurance, because she did not need reassurance. She needed a moment to feel what she was feeling. He simply sat with her, which was the right thing, which was always what he seemed to know to do. "He let it go," she said finally. "He had no choice. He had a choice. He chose the money over the fight." She folded the letter. "In a way, that tells me everything I needed to know about what I was worth to him." Owen reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "What you're worth," he said quietly, "has nothing to do with what he decided." She turned her hand over under his and held on. The full accounting of what she felt about her father would take longer than one afternoon, she knew. It would take time and distance, and probably some nights lying awake in the dark that she would have to work through. But the legal and material danger was over, and the inheritance was hers, and she was sitting in her cousin's kitchen in Colorado Territory with her husband's hand warm around hers, and the mountains were out the window, and it was spring. She could work with this. They used part of the inheritance to establish themselves properly, not extravagantly. Winifred was not inclined toward extravagance, and Owen had even less use for it, but practically, solidly. They put money into Thomas's trading operation in exchange for a formal partnership share, which gave Owen legitimate work with Thomas on the supply routes, and gave Winifred the accounts and correspondence work she had identified from the beginning as where she would be useful. They found a house in Pueblo proper, a small but well-built place 2 blocks from the main street with a garden space out back that Winifred intended to make productive. She planted things in April. Vegetables and herbs, and 2 young apple trees that the nursery man said would take 3 years to bear fruit. She planted them with the specific determination of someone who is committing to a place, who is saying with their hands in the dirt, "I am here. This is mine. I intend to stay." Owen watched her plant the apple trees from the porch with his morning coffee, and the expression that had become her favorite of all his expressions, which was the open, unhurried one that she saw most often when he thought she wasn't looking, and that told her, more than any words, that she was the thing he valued most. "You're going to talk to those trees," he said. "I'm not going to talk to trees, Owen. You talk to the tomato plants." She kept digging. That was an aberration. She talked to the apple trees. She did this privately, in the early mornings when Owen was loading the wagon for Thomas and the street was quiet, and she told them things she was working through, and the telling helped, which was possibly the most useful function of something that could not talk back. She wrote to her cousin in Colorado more often now that they lived in the same town, which was unnecessary but pleasant. She wrote to no one in Hays City. There was no one there she wanted to hear from. Dale Pruitt appeared once more in May. She was at the store on Main Street when she saw him through the window, which was enough time to compose herself. He came in and stood by the door and looked at her with those empty eyes, and she looked back at him with the full settled certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she stood. "Your father asked me to deliver a message," he said. "You can tell him," she said pleasantly, "that his messages are not welcome here, and that my legal counsel in Denver would be very interested to know that his representative is making contact with me. That would constitute harassment under territorial law." She paused. "Good day, Mr. Pruitt." He left. She was shaking slightly when she turned back to her shopping, but it was the shaking of contained anger rather than fear, and she knew the difference. Owen was home when she got back. She told him, and he was quiet in the specific way that told her he was containing something, and then he said, "Should I speak to him?" "No," she said. "I handled it." "I know you handled it," he said. "I'm asking if you want me to also speak to him." She looked at him. "No," she said again, more gently. "He won't be back." He wasn't. The summer of 1879 in Pueblo was wide and warm and golden. Winifred's garden grew with the enthusiastic excess of a first garden that has been given too much attention and exactly the right soil, and the tomatoes were particularly spectacular. Owen's work with Thomas expanded to include a new route north to Cheyenne that required occasional trips of a week or more, and during those trips, Winifred managed the accounts and wrote the correspondence, and ran her portion of the operation with the satisfied competence of a woman doing work that is genuinely suited to her. Marjorie had a baby in July, a boy they named James Thomas, and the event filled the house with the particular warm chaos of new life and reorganized everything. Winifred held James Thomas at 2 days old and felt something move in her chest that was different from anything she had felt before, profound and quiet and very personal. Owen came home from Cheyenne that week to find her in Marjorie's parlor with the baby asleep in her arms, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she had not specifically seen before, which was a new thing after 10 months together, and it took her a moment to identify it correctly. Wanting, she thought, not the immediate kind, the patient, certain, forward-looking kind. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. "He weighs nothing, it's remarkable." Owen came in and sat beside her and looked at the baby in her arms with that expression. "Owen," she said. "Winifred," he said. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" "Probably," he said. James Thomas opened his eyes and then immediately closed them again. "Not immediately," she said. "We need another year." "I know," he said. "But eventually." "Yes," he said. "Eventually." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in Marjorie's parlor while the summer afternoon moved around the house and James Thomas slept between them, and everything felt, in a way that was still slightly startling to Winifred, completely and absolutely right. The year turned. 1880 came in with heavy snow and a cold that kept everyone inside, and turned the mountains into something from another world entirely, white and vast and brilliant under clear winter skies. Winifred spent the cold months reading and managing accounts, and having long conversations with Owen by the fire in their small house that ranged across topics she had not previously had anyone willing to engage with, from territorial statehood arguments to the ethics of the land policies affecting the Ute and Arapaho people still in the region, to the works of certain American authors she was working through with methodical pleasure. Owen was not a man who had had much formal education, but he was the kind of person for whom this was irrelevant because he was constitutionally incapable of encountering an idea without engaging with it fully. He read everything she put in front of him and argued about it with real attention, and was willing, with characteristic honesty, to say when something had changed his mind, which she found consistently more interesting than someone who was never changed. In February, she told him. She told him at breakfast, because she was not a dramatic woman and saw no reason to create occasion out of something that was simply, in the best possible way, a fact. "I am expecting a child," she said. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the open, unguarded one she loved best, but with something else layered beneath it, something she identified after a moment as the look of a man who had not, at some fundamental level, fully believed he was going to get to have this, and who was now being confronted with the evidence that he was. "Winifred," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and took her hands and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had been watching everything for so long and now had absolutely nothing behind them except this. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you?" He stopped, started again. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about a year and a half ago, climbing out of a window in the dark, $32 and a carpet bag and a letter that had explained her father's full understanding of her worth. She thought about the creek and the plains and the boarding house and the ring on a Denver boardwalk. She thought about the apple trees she had planted that were going to take 3 years to bear fruit. "I feel," she said, "that plans change in ways you cannot anticipate, and that most of the best things in my life have arrived by routes I did not plan." He kissed her hands, both of them, one after the other, with the deliberate tenderness of a man who understood that this was a moment that should be marked. "I am so glad," he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "that plans change." The spring of 1880 was gentler than any spring she had experienced in Colorado, or perhaps she was simply paying attention differently. Her garden came back with the extravagance of plants that have established themselves well in their first year, and the apple trees, which were in only their second spring, showed a tentative proliferation of buds that the nursery man said was a good sign. She managed the accounts through the summer and took shorter walks and read a great deal, and had conversations with Owen in the evenings that were some of the finest hours she could account for, about who this person would be, what they hoped to give them, what kind of world they were building around a new life in Colorado in 1880, which was still a rough and complicated place in many ways, but was also, genuinely and undeniably, a place where something new was possible. Owen was home for the last 2 months of the pregnancy, which he arranged by taking on only local supply work rather than the longer northern routes. He did not make a production of this. He simply arranged it and was there, and when she pointed out that he was being protective in a way that was bordering on hovering, he said with perfect Owen equanimity, "I'm not hovering. I'm present," and she decided the distinction was acceptable. The baby arrived in October, a boy. Owen was there, which was somewhat unusual for the time and place, but he had made it clear to the doctor and to Marjorie, who was managing the household arrangements, that he had no intention of being anywhere else, and his particular quality of calm certainty made it easier to simply include him than to argue him out. He was in the room when their son arrived in the world, and the sound the baby made, the first incredulous, indignant announcement of existence, was met with a silence from Owen that was so complete and so profound that she had to look at him. He was looking at the baby. His face was doing something she had never seen it do before. The open, unguarded expression had been overtaken entirely by something that had no calculation in it whatsoever, something simple and absolute and complete. "Owen," she said. He looked at her. "Come here," she said. He came. They named him Samuel Gerald Ramsey, the Samuel for Owen's grandfather, who by all accounts had been a man of great integrity, and the Gerald she crossed out immediately, replacing it with James in honor of Marjorie's boy who had come before him and made everything feel possible. Samuel James Ramsey. The name sat well. Samuel James Ramsey was, from his first moments, a person of strong opinions and clear expression. He had Owen's eyes, that particular gray-green, and Winifred's facility for making himself precisely understood without wasting words, which at age 3 weeks manifested primarily as a remarkable precision of communication regarding hunger and sleep, but which already suggested a character. Owen held him in the evenings after supper with the same still, focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and Winifred would watch from across the room with the book open in her hands that she was not reading, looking at these two people, this child and this man who had been a stranger 18 months ago, and who were now the architecture of her world. And she would feel the particular quiet fullness of a life that has arrived where it was going. Christmas of 1880 was warm and crowded and good. Marjorie and Thomas and their son James came, and there was a great deal of food and noise and the pleasant chaos of two small children who regarded each other with the serious mutual assessment of people encountering a new species. Samuel James, at 2 months old, had opinions about James Thomas, aged 17 months, that were communicated primarily through expression and volume. Owen made a wooden toy. He had been making it in secret for weeks, a small carved horse, and it was not the finest carving she had ever seen, but it was made with patient care and the specific love of a man doing something for the first time because someone needs it to exist. He gave it to Samuel James, who was too young to know what it was, and James Thomas immediately wanted it, and Owen produced a second one from his pocket with the quiet preparedness of a man who plans for contingencies. Thomas caught Winifred's eye across the room and raised his cup. She raised hers back. The spring letter from Cornelius Park, when it came in March of 1881, was the last legal correspondence related to her father's affairs. The Federal Review had concluded. The inheritance, now fully and legally hers, had been untouched by her father's attempts and was entirely clear. Park recommended keeping certain documents filed for protective purposes, but indicated that, absent new action from her father, the matter was fully resolved. She read the letter and put it in the wooden box she kept in her desk for documents that needed to be kept but not thought about daily. She picked up Samuel James, who was 4 months old and had recently discovered that he could make a specific noise that produced results, and she walked out to the back garden where the apple trees were going into their 3rd spring. They had buds. Actual, promising, about to become something buds. Owen was at the fence looking at them. "They're going to flower," she said. "Looks like it," he said. She stood beside him with Samuel James against her shoulder, and they looked at the apple trees in their 3rd spring, and the mountains were behind the rooftops to the west, and the sky was that specific Colorado blue that she had decided was her favorite color in the world. "Owen," she said. "Winifred," he said. "I am glad," she said, "that I climbed out that window." He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the open, unguarded, wholly certain one. "I am glad," he said, "that I took that job," she laughed. "That is a terrible thing to be glad about." "I am glad about what it led to," he said. Samuel James made an opinion. "He agrees," Owen said. "He is 4 months old." "He's advanced," Owen said, with the complete unreasonable confidence of a father, and she laughed again, which was something she did with a freedom now that still sometimes surprised her. And he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood in the garden with the apple trees flowering into their 3rd spring and the mountains watching over everything. And the life that had been built out of a midnight escape, and a complicated bounty, and a boarding house in Dodge City, and a letter returned, and a ring on a Denver boardwalk, and a garden planted with the intention of staying spread around them in every direction, wide and warm and entirely their own. The following summer the apple trees bore fruit for the first time. Small and slightly irregular, the way first-year fruit tends to be, but genuinely and undeniably apples, which Owen tasted with the expression of someone who expected nothing and was mildly astonished to receive something, and which Winifred made into a small quantity of preserves that she gave to Marjorie, who pronounced them excellent. Samuel James, by then approaching his 2nd birthday, stood in the garden and looked at the apple tree with the serious expression that was becoming characteristically his, and then looked at his mother, and then looked at the tree again. Apple, Winifred said. Apple, Samuel James said. Exactly right, she said. She looked up and Owen was watching from the porch with his morning coffee and that expression, the one she had first identified as wanting of the patient, forward-looking kind, and she thought she recognized it now as something simpler and truer than that word. Gratitude, perhaps. The deep, quiet, earned kind. She raised an apple at him. He raised his coffee cup back. And 2 years beyond that, when the territory was filling up and Pueblo was growing and the trading operation had expanded to 3 routes, and the house had acquired a second bedroom because Samuel James was old enough to need his own space, she discovered she was expecting again, and she told Owen at breakfast in the same direct and simple way as the first time. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "How do you feel?" he said. "I feel," she said, "that plans change in ways you cannot anticipate, and that all the best things arrive by routes I didn't plan." "You've said that before," he said. "It keeps being true," she said. He put down the coffee cup and came around the table and kissed her in the morning kitchen, with the winter light coming through the window and Samuel James still asleep in his room, and the mountains out there somewhere behind the Colorado sky, and the life they had built around them, every piece of it chosen and real and entirely theirs. Their daughter arrived the following October. They named her Clara, after Owen's grandmother, a woman he had described once in careful words as the only person in his childhood who had seemed to see him clearly, and the name felt right, felt like the carrying forward of something good. Clara came into the world with a particular quality of stillness that was different from her brother's noisy announcement of himself, and she looked at the room around her with those gray-green eyes that she had clearly inherited in full, and she looked at Owen when he held her with an expression of such calm mutual recognition that Marjorie, who was present as she always was for the arrivals in this family, said softly, "Well, she knows her father." And Owen looked up from Clara's face with the expression that was no longer rare, that he wore easily and well now, the open, wholly unguarded one. Samuel James was 3 years old and regarded his sister with the complex mixture of fascination and suspicion that characterizes children encountering new siblings, and within a week had decided she was acceptable, and within a month was positioning himself as her particular protector, which Owen noticed and said nothing about because it was exactly right. The apple trees bore good fruit by their 5th year, properly and fully, the way things do when they have been given time and the right soil and the patience to become what they are. Winifred made preserves and apple butter, and contributed several pounds to Marjorie's kitchen, and stood in the garden in the October evening with the smell of harvest around her and Owen beside her, and the mountains going to snow at their peaks, and thought about a woman who had climbed out of a window in the dark with $32 and a stolen letter, and everything ahead of her unresolved and terrifying and wild. That woman had not planned any of this. She had not planned Dodge City or the boarding house or the man who sat 2 tables away and did not look at her once. She had not planned the night ride across the dark Kansas plains or the creek, or the 5 days of riding through Indian Territory or the fire on the last night in Colorado. She had not planned the morning when he said, "I need to tell you something," or the December night when he said, "I have spent my entire adult life moving from one place to the next." She had not planned the ring on the Denver boardwalk, or the apple trees planted with the intention of staying, or the boy with the gray-green eyes, or the girl who had them too. None of it had been in the plan. All of it was the best thing she had ever done. Owen put his hand around hers in the autumn garden. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the house. She looked at him. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am very grateful for what I didn't plan." He squeezed her hand. "Me too," he said. The evening settled around them. From inside the house came the sound of Samuel James and Clara in some vigorous negotiation, and Marjorie's voice from somewhere, and the particular warm noise of a household that is full of people who belong together. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The apple trees held their fruit. The stars, when the sky darkened, came out over Colorado in their usual brilliant abundance. The same stars she had looked at in the Kansas plains 16 years ago when she was a woman running from something, now familiar and comfortable and hers. Owen poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the porch in the cooling evening and drank them. And the conversation moved where it always moved between them, across whatever was interesting and real. And sometimes they were quiet for long stretches in the way of two people who have learned that the silence between them is not empty, but full of everything that doesn't need to be said because it is already understood. This was not the life she had planned. It was so far beyond what she would have planned that the word plan seemed almost quaint when she held it up against the reality of what had grown. She had planned freedom. She had gotten it, and so much more than it, because the plan had changed. Owen looked at her across the porch with those gray-green eyes in the evening light, and the almost smile that had become a real smile years ago, and in his face she saw, as she always did, the whole accounting of how they had arrived here. The bounty and the boarding house, the darkness and the creek, the truth told at a kitchen table, the ring in a winter street. The apple trees planted with the intention of staying. "You were not part of my plan," he had said. "I am glad plans change." She was glad, too. She would always be glad. In all the years and seasons and mornings and children and arguments and reconciliations, and apple harvests and mountain winters and long conversations by the fire that were still ahead of them, she would carry this gladness with her the way she carried the ring on her finger, the way she carried his name, the way she carried the particular certainty of a woman who had walked into her life with her eyes open and found, waiting there, the precise and extraordinary thing she had not known to look for. The stars came up over Pueblo, Colorado, and inside the house Samuel James was explaining something to Clara at considerable length, and the mountains were there in the dark, and Owen Ramsey's hand was warm around hers, and everything was, every piece of it, exactly where it was supposed to be.